In the last video, you learned how to create logical tests. And logical tests are always going to return a true or a false value. Well, the next step from creating logical tests is the ability to replace the true or the false with a value of your choice. Now, this value can be text, it can be numbers, or it can even be a calculation. And you can do this using an if statement. Now, an if statement is a logical test that basically replaces the value of true or value of false with a value that you select. The syntax for an if statement is equal to if, and then it looks for a logical test. After the logical test, you then put in the value of true or the value of false. Now, both the value of true and the value of false, if you look at the syntax of the if statement, are included within square brackets. When you're writing any formula in Excel and you get the screen tips and you notice that criteria of the formula are included in screen tips, this means that you can leave this particular criteria blank. So you don't necessarily have to have a value of true or a value of false. But then using an if statement, there's no point in really using an if statement if you're not going to replace the trues or the falses. So let's get stuck in and have a look at some examples of if statements. Our first if statement we're going to look at is just to get a hang of writing if statements. So we're going to say if the value of the logical test is true, then we're going to use the word except. If it's false, we are going to use the word reject. So let's start creating our if statement. So first of all, it's looking for our logical test. Now remember from our comparative operators, we can use any of the comparative operators in our logical tests. So we're going to say if 5 basically equals to 5 just for this example, and then you need to put into a comma to skip to the next criteria of the formula. The next criteria is your value if true. Now, if you're using text, you need to put it into inverted commas. So let's say we will accept, and then if we put in a comma, it then moves to the next screen tip, which is value if false, and we're going to say reject. And again, in inverted commas, and then close your bracket. So we should get accept in here because they are equal. Now, if we change the value to 6, we get reject because the logical test doesn't meet the criteria, and so a false value is returned, and so we get the value if false. Now let's go back in here. When you select a formula, if you press F2, it's going to bring you back into edit mode. Now we've seen that we do not have to have in a value if false, so I'm going to just delete the value of false and close the formula and see that when you don't have a value for false, the default is false. If you don't have a value for true, the default is going to be true. So let's go back and undo. I'm going to use the undo button to undo what I done there. And if we edit the formula again, and this time we are going to delete the value for accept. Now, when we delete the value for accept, to skip on to the next criteria in the formula, you need to include the commas. So now we can say that that is rejected. We haven't put in a value if true. So when we get a match, it's going to give us a 0. Now a 0 equals a true. A 1 equals a false. So that's the basics of our if statements. So now let's have a look at some practical examples of if statements. Our first example is a basic if statement, and we have some orders here. We've order 1, 2, and 3 and the order value, and we want to calculate the discount amount. Now the criteria that we have been given is that the discount is 5%, but we'll only get the discount if the order is above the minimum sales of 5,000. So we need to create an if statement to calculate whether or not it is above the 5,000, and if so, we can then replace the true result with a calculation. So let's go ahead and start our if statement. So we start with an equals and we will say if. So our logical test is going to be, is our 2,500, so I'm selecting the cell with the value, is this greater than or equal to our minimum sales of 5,000. So that's our logical test. Now, if it's true, what do we want to do? Well, we want to take our order value and we want to multiply it by the 5%. If it's false, we don't want any discount. So we have an option here. We can put in a value of false or leave it blank to get a false return. We can also, for our value of false, we can put in a blank, or we could put in a 0. Now, if you wanted a blank, you would use 2 quotes together. This is going to return a blank. But if you wanted a 0 value in here, you would put in 0 and hit enter. Now we see that we have no discount because the 2,500 is less than the 5,000. If we change that to 7,500, it's now above the 5,000, so it's getting 5%. Now I'm going to go back into this formula here. I'm going to press F2 to edit the formula. And now that we're in the formula, when we drag this formula down, we want to be able to lock in our cell references. When we drag our formula down, we want this 5% to be locked in and this 5,000 to be locked in, but we don't want this cell over here, the order value, to be locked in. Let me show you exactly what I mean. If we just pull this formula down as it is, it's not going to work because the cell references are relative cell references instead of absolute or locked in cell references. So let's go into this formula here and press F2, and we see that when we drag the formula down, that these cells also dragged down 1. Now our order value dragged down 1, which is correct, but we don't want our minimum sales and our discount amount to drag down with us. So let's go back in here and let us edit this formula here. So we want our D10 and our D9 to be locked in. So if we select our D10, and I'm going to go up into the formula bar, I'm going to select D10 and I'm going to press F4. I'm also going to select D9 and press F4. Now this puts the relative and absolute cell references wrapped around the cell references. So the $sign represents that we have absoluted or we have locked in our cell reference. Now it's important that you understand relative and absolute cell references because we've got two $signs. We've got $1 beside the column number and we have $1 beside the row number. So when you have $1 beside both the column and the row, the cell is going to be locked in no matter what way you do things. But if you have $1 only in front of the column name, when you drag your formulas, the column will actually lock. When you have it in front of the row, it's the row that will lock. So we have our locked in cell references now, and I've locked in both the rows and the columns because I know I'm only pulling it one way and it's not going to make any difference. So now if we go into our last formula and press F2 to edit, we can see that these original cells have been locked in. They didn't drag with the formula. So that is the basics of an if statement with a little bit of understanding of relative and absolute cell references. Let's have a look at another if statement now. And this time we're going to look at combining an if statement with an and statement. So our criteria is that we have a discount of 5% when sales are above 5,000 and are less than 7,500. So we have two criteria that need to be met. We have the above and the below values. So we would use the and statement within the if statement. So let's go ahead and create our if statement. So we're going to start with an and, because we're testing to see if our order value is greater than or equal to our minimum value of sales, and put in a comma to skip to our next logical operator. And then we're going to see, is our order value less than or equal to our maximum sales. Now we can close the bracket on our and statement, and then we can move on to the value if true. Well, if the value is true, we're going to take our order value and we're going to multiply it by our discount. Otherwise, we are going to leave a blank. Now, I didn't lock in any cells there, and I do want to just drag the formula down instead of copying the formula. So all the cells that we want to lock in, we need to wrap these with the dollar symbol by using the F4. So these are all of the cells that are in column D. So I'm going to select D20 and press F4, D21 within our formula and press F4, and D19 within our formula and press F4. Now we can hit enter on our formula, and we've been given a blank. It doesn't even look like there's anything in the cell there because we requested a blank to be returned if the criteria are not met. Now 2,500 is less than the minimum sales, so they won't get any discount. Let's fill this formula down now, and we can see when we fill the formula down that we have a discount against our 5,000, but we don't have a discount against our 10,000. And this is because our 10,000 is above the maximum sales value. Let's change this down to 7,400 and change this up to 3,000. The 3,000 still doesn't get a discount, but the 7,400 does. So that's how you can combine an if statement with an and statement. And combining an if statement with an and statement is exactly the same as combining an if statement with an or statement. The difference in use is that when you use an and statement, both criteria must be met. When you use the or statement, only one criteria must be met. We are moving on very fast, but now we're going to look at nested if statements. A nested if statement is when you include one if statement inside another if statement, and you can have multiple if statements included within the one if statement. The problem with this is that when your if statements become long, they're very difficult to read and understand, and they're almost as difficult to write as well. So when you have long if statements, first of all, if you're trying to evaluate them, don't forget the evaluate function that we looked at earlier on. Also, don't be afraid to break your formula down into smaller chunks and allow the answer from one formula feed in as a criteria for another formula. So let's take a look now at our nested if statements. We have the following criteria. Sales above 5,000 get 5%. Sales above 7,000 get 7%, and sales above 15,000 get 10%. So we're going to need to use nested if statements because using and or just are not going to cut it right now. So let's go ahead at building a nested if statement. So first of all, we start with our normal if statement and our first logical test. Our first logical test is going to test to see if our order value is greater than or if it's equal to the highest value. Now, the order you select these actually does matter. In this case, we need to start with the highest value because if we get a true, we know our 5,000 isn't greater than 15,000. So we're going to get a false and it'll move straight on. However, if we had this start equal to our 5,000 up here and the value was a higher value and we got a true, it won't move on to the false, and you will get errors. So make sure you put these in the correct order. Now I'm going to lock in that value. The value, if true, is going to be our order value multiplied by our discount. And again, F4 to lock in our discount. Now it's looking for a value if false. Well, the value of false is that if it's greater than 10,000, it's 7%. And if it's greater than 5,000, it's 5%. So we still have more logical tests to do. So to do this, we will add in another if statement. And this time we're going to say if our order value is greater than or equal to the 10,000, locking this in. And if it is, then we want our order value, and we're going to multiply this by our discount amount and press F4 to lock this value in. Then we have a value if false. Well, the value if false, if we weren't expecting any sales lower than 5,000, we could just say, take our order value and multiply it by 5,000. But we may have sales lower than 5,000 that get 0. So we need another logical test. So we put in another if statement as our value if false. So if our value if false, if our 5,000, if our sales value of 5,000 is greater than or equal to our sales of 5,000, locking that in, then we want to take our order value and multiply it by our discount. Now our value, if false, we can put in a 0 because we have no more logical tests to carry out. Now when we close the bracket once, we close it on the last if statement we created. When we close it the second time, we close it on the second if statement. And when we close the bracket the third time, we close it on the initial if statement. We can hit enter and we can pull these values down. So now we see that our formula is working well for us, that we have included our 3 different logical tests within our if statement by using a nested if statement. Now I mentioned that the order that you place these in is of utmost importance. I'm going to recalculate this now and show you exactly what I mean by this. So this time I'm going to take the other order. And I'm going to take if our order value is greater than or equal to the 5,000, and I'm going to press F4 to lock it in. Then we want our 5,000 multiplied by our discount amount. Otherwise, if our order value is greater than or equal to the 10,000 and lock that in, then we want our order value multiplied by our discount, and I'm going to lock that in. And finally, if our order value is greater than or equal to the 15,000, then I want our order value multiplied by our discount and F4 to lock that in. Otherwise, I want 0 as my value if false. Now, I know this formula is not correct. I have gone in the wrong order, but it's important that you understand that the order actually matters. So for the first one, we got the correct result. But if we fill these down, we'll see that we don't exactly get the same values for each of these. Now, why is this? Well, what happens here with the 12,000 is that Excel comes along and says, okay, is 12,000 greater than or equal to 5,000? Well, the answer straight away is yes, it is greater than or equal to 5,000. So it's going to return the value if true. And the value if true is 5%. So although 12,000 is greater than 10,000, it passed the first logical test and gave a true result. And so you got the wrong answer because the order actually matters. The same with the 16,000. It's actually calculated at 5% when we have the order in the wrong place. Because it says, is the 16,000 greater than the 5,000? Well, the answer is true. And so straight away it multiplied by the 5% and doesn't move on to the rest of the functions. Whereas with the correct formula, first of all, it says, is the 16,000 greater than the 15,000? The answer is yes, it is. And so multiplies it by 10%. In our 12,000, it first says, is it greater than 15,000? And the answer is no, it's not greater. So it moves on to the second logical test and says, is it greater than or equal to 10,000? Where the answer is actually true. So it returns the value of true for that particular if statement. So it's really important that you understand that the order of these things actually does matter. And the best thing you can do is put it into practice and carry out some examples until you get used to carrying out if statements and nested if statements.